a man who survived 20 years of silence, a woman who refused to ask permission, and the stubborn donkey that changed everything. In the frozen wasteland of Iron Ridge, Caleb Vance buried more than his family. He buried his capacity to feel. For 2 decades, he existed rather than lived, a ghost on a desolate ranch where winter never truly ended. Then Eliza Hart arrived, uninvited, unafraid, and dragging along the most infuriating donkey in the entire frontier. What began as a collision of 2 damaged souls would become something neither expected, a fight against loneliness so deep it had become identity itself. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The wind cut across Iron Ridge like a blade forged in hell's own furnace and tempered in the Arctic void. It was the kind of cold that didn't just bite. It devoured, stripping away pretense and comfort until only raw survival remained. Caleb Vance stood on the porch of his ranch house, a structure as weathered and hollow as the man who inhabited it, watching the horizon with eyes that had forgotten how to hope. 50 years old, 20 of them spent in this self-imposed exile. The mathematics of grief were simple. 1 wife, 2 children, all 3 graves on the hill behind the barn. The arithmetic of survival was simpler still. Wake, work, sleep, repeat. No variables, no complications, no room for anything that resembled living. Caleb's hands, scarred and calloused from decades of hard labor, gripped the porch railing. The wood was rough beneath his palms, solid and real, unlike the ghosts that still walked through his dreams. He'd built this ranch with those hands, back when they'd been younger and steadier, back when Sarah's laugh had filled the spaces between the wind's howl, back when his children's voices had made the silence bearable. Now there was only the wind, and the land, and the punishing routine that kept memory at bay. The ranch sprawled across 200 acres of unforgiving terrain, rolling hills that turned treacherous with ice, forests thick with pine and shadow, pastures that grew sparse grass in summer and became white deserts in winter. His cattle, hardy beasts bred for this brutal climate, dotted the landscape like dark stones scattered by a careless god. They were his only companions now, and he preferred it that way. Cattle didn't ask questions. Cattle didn't expect conversation. Cattle didn't leave. Except when they died, of course. But death was honest. Death didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. Caleb turned to go inside when movement caught his eye. A dark smudge on the white canvas of his eastern pasture. He stopped, muscles tensing with the reflexive wariness of a man who'd learned to distrust the unexpected. Visitors were rare in Iron Ridge. The town, such as it was, lay 15 miles south, a collection of buildings huddled together against the cold like frightened animals. Most folks had the good sense to stay put during winter, especially this deep into the season when the snow fell heavy and the ice made every road a gamble. But someone was coming. Caleb watched as the smudge resolved into a wagon, old, weathered, pulled by a single horse that looked as tired as he felt. The wagon moved slowly, deliberately, cutting a path through his land with the audacity of ownership or desperation. Probably both. His jaw tightened. 20 years without uninvited guests, and now this. He stepped off the porch, his boots crunching through the crust of ice that covered everything. The cold bit through his wool coat, but he barely noticed. Cold was a constant companion, familiar as breathing. He walked toward the approaching wagon with long strides, each step purposeful, each breath forming clouds in the frigid air. As the distance closed, details emerged. The driver was a woman. He could tell by the set of her shoulders, the way she held the reins with competence rather than bravado. She wore a heavy coat, dark and practical, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the wind. Her face remained hidden until she drew the wagon to a stop about 20 feet from where he stood. Then she looked up, and Caleb felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Genuine surprise. She wasn't young, 45 maybe, with lines around her eyes that spoke of experience rather than age. Her face was strong, angular, the kind of face that belonged to someone who'd weathered storms both literal and metaphorical. But it was her eyes that struck him, steady, clear, and completely unintimidated by his presence or his obvious displeasure. "Morning," she said, her voice cutting through the wind with surprising clarity, not loud, but firm. Certain. Caleb didn't respond immediately. He'd lost the habit of small talk, of social niceties, of the dance people performed when they wanted something from each other. Instead, he waited, letting the silence stretch between them like a challenge. The woman didn't flinch. She simply sat there, reins in hand, meeting his stare with the patience of someone who'd dealt with difficult men before and found them tedious rather than terrifying. "This is private property," Caleb finally said, his voice rough from disuse. He spoke so rarely these days that his own words sounded foreign to his ears. "I know." The woman nodded, unfazed. "You're Caleb Vance. I'm Eliza Hart." She stated it as fact, not introduction, as if her presence required no justification beyond her name. Caleb felt his irritation spike. "You're trespassing, Miss Hart." "Mrs. Hart," she corrected mildly. "Widow Hart, technically, though I don't much care for the word, makes me sound like I'm waiting for something that isn't coming back." The casual mention of widowhood, delivered without plea for sympathy or dramatic pause, threw Caleb off balance. Most people, in his limited recent experience, treated loss like a weapon or a shield. This woman wielded it like simple fact. "That doesn't give you right of way across my land," he said, regrouping. Eliza tilted her head slightly, studying him with those unsettlingly direct eyes. "I'm not looking for right of way, Mr. Vance. I'm looking for a place to stay. Winter's getting worse, and I'm a midwife. Town could use one. I heard you have an old cabin on the western edge of your property. Hasn't been used in years. I'm willing to pay rent." "No." The word came out flat, absolute. Caleb had learned that the fastest way to end unwanted conversations was through blunt refusal. No explanations, no negotiations, just no. But Eliza Hart didn't seem to understand that particular social contract. Instead of looking disappointed or offended, she simply nodded as if he'd said something worth considering rather than a door slammed shut. "May I ask why?" she said. "You may not." "I see." She paused, then continued as if he hadn't just dismissed her. "The cabin's been empty for 2 decades, Mr. Vance. I checked the county records. Before that, it was occupied by a family named Morrison, sheep farmers who moved to Oregon in 1851. Since then, nothing. It's sitting there rotting into the ground, serving no purpose except to remind you that things fall apart when they're not maintained." Caleb's hands clenched into fists. The audacity of this woman, arriving uninvited, demanding shelter, and now lecturing him about his own property. "You've got nerve," he said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "I've got necessity," Eliza replied, her tone never changing. "And you've got space you're not using. I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Vance. I'm offering a fair exchange. I'll pay you monthly rent, $20, which is more than generous for a cabin in that condition. I'll maintain the property, make my own repairs, and I won't bother you. I'm a midwife and occasional nurse. I keep odd hours, I mind my own business, and I don't gossip. All I need is a roof and 4 walls." I said no. "Why?" The question hung in the air between them, simple and impossible. Why? Because he didn't want strangers on his land. Because he'd spent 20 years building walls between himself and the world. Because the cabin she mentioned had belonged to his foreman, back when the ranch was thriving, back when he'd needed help, back when he'd been a different man entirely. Because that cabin held memories he had no intention of disturbing. But Caleb didn't say any of that. Instead, he simply stared at Eliza Hart, willing her to recognize the futility of her request and leave. She stared back. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for the sudden explosive sound that erupted from behind the wagon, a noise somewhere between a screech and a bellow, impossibly loud and aggressively indignant. Caleb's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle he wasn't carrying, his body tensing for threat. But Eliza merely sighed, a long-suffering sound that suggested deep familiarity with whatever had just announced itself. "That's Maple," she said. "What the hell is Maple?" As if summoned by his question, a donkey emerged from behind the wagon. Not walked, not trotted, but emerged, as if the animal had been waiting for precisely the right dramatic moment to make its entrance. It was the most absurd creature Caleb had ever seen, shaggy, gray, with ears that seemed 2 sizes too large for its head and an expression of supreme self-satisfaction. The donkey looked directly at Caleb and brayed again, even louder this time. She's vocal, Eliza said unnecessarily. Caleb stared at the animal, then at Eliza, then back at the animal. You brought a donkey. She brought herself, really. Maple doesn't much believe in ownership. She's more of a companion than property. The donkey, as if understanding and approving of this description, shook its head vigorously, making its ridiculous ears flap like flags in the wind. I don't want a donkey on my property. Then you're in luck, Eliza said pleasantly, because Maple comes with me, and you've already made it clear I'm not welcome. We'll be on our way. She gathered the reins, preparing to turn the wagon around. It was the reasonable response to rejection, the expected retreat. Caleb should have felt relief. He should have watched her go without a second thought, but something in the set of her shoulders, proud despite the dismissal, unbowed despite his harshness, made him hesitate. Wait, he heard himself say, the word escaping before he could stop it. Eliza paused, looking back at him with those steady eyes. She didn't speak, didn't push. She simply waited, giving him space to either commit to the word he'd spoken or retreat from it. Caleb cursed internally. He was 50 years old, not some green boy swayed by a pretty face, though Eliza Hart wasn't pretty in any conventional sense. Handsome, maybe. Striking. The kind of face that improved with adversity rather than wilted under it. The cabin's in bad shape, he said slowly, hating every word. Roof probably leaks. Floors are likely rotted. Might not even be habitable. I'll manage. $25 a month, and you stay on your side of the property. I don't want unexpected visitors, and I don't want that damn donkey wandering onto my land. Eliza's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. A spark of what might have been amusement or triumph or simple satisfaction. Agreed. Though I should warn you, Maple has her own ideas about property boundaries. As if to prove the point, the donkey chose that moment to walk directly up to Caleb, close enough that he could smell her distinctly barn-like odor, and sniffed his coat with aggressive curiosity. Get your animal under control, Caleb growled. She's not my animal, Eliza reminded him. She's her own creature. But Maple... She directed her voice toward the donkey, which swiveled one enormous ear in her direction. We're guests here. Best behavior. Maple responded by attempting to bite Caleb's coat button. Caleb jerked backward, his composure finally cracking. This is a mistake. Probably, Eliza agreed cheerfully. But it's too late now. You've already said yes, and I'm a woman who takes a man at his word. I assume you're a man who keeps his? It was a trap, elegantly laid. To refuse now would be to admit his word meant nothing, to reveal himself as someone who could be swayed by a badly behaved donkey and his own rising irritation. Follow me, Caleb said curtly, turning on his heel and walking toward his horse tied near the barn. And keep that animal away from my cattle. Behind him, he heard Eliza click her tongue, urging her tired horse forward. The wagon creaked into motion, and Maple, contrary creature that she was, let out another triumphant bray that echoed across the frozen wasteland of Iron Ridge. Caleb mounted his horse, a sturdy roan gelding named Grant, who'd been with him for 8 years and had the good sense to remain silent about his master's questionable decisions. Together, they led Eliza Hart, her wagon, and her impossible donkey toward the western edge of the property, where the old Morrison cabin waited like a relic of a life Caleb had spent 20 years trying to forget. The journey took 30 minutes across terrain that grew progressively rougher. Ice covered everything, turning simple slopes into treacherous descents. Caleb navigated automatically, his body remembering paths his mind had stopped acknowledging years ago. Behind him, Eliza's wagon followed, wheels crunching through frozen snow, the sounds sharp in the winter air. They didn't speak. Caleb had no interest in conversation, and Eliza seemed content with silence, a quality he found himself reluctantly appreciating. Most people felt compelled to fill quiet spaces with meaningless noise. This woman understood that silence had its own value, its own language. Maple, however, did not share this understanding. The donkey brayed periodically, as if commenting on the landscape or complaining about the pace or simply reminding the world of her existence. Each time, Caleb's jaw tightened a fraction more. Finally, they crested a small rise, and the cabin came into view. Caleb hadn't seen it in years. had actively avoided this part of his property for reasons he refused to examine too closely. Now, looking at the structure, he felt something twist in his chest. It was worse than he'd remembered. The cabin sagged like a dying animal. Its roof bowed under the weight of accumulated snow and time. 2 windows were broken, covered with boards that had weathered to the same gray as the walls. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges, and the front porch, never substantial to begin with, had partially collapsed, leaving splintered wood jutting up like broken bones. This wasn't a home. It was a corpse of a home. Caleb reined Grant to a stop and turned to look at Eliza, certain she would finally show some crack in her composure, some recognition of the impossibility she'd undertaken. But Eliza simply studied the cabin with the same assessing gaze she'd turned on Caleb himself, her expression neutral, calculating. "It has potential," she said finally. Caleb nearly laughed, would have if he'd remembered how. "It has holes. Holes can be patched." Eliza climbed down from the wagon with practiced ease, her boots hitting the frozen ground with solid certainty. She walked toward this cabin, each step deliberate, and Caleb found himself watching despite his determination to remain uninvolved. She moved well, not with the delicate steps of a woman who expected men to clear paths for her, but with the confident stride of someone who'd cleared her own paths for years and saw no reason to change. When she reached the porch, she tested the boards carefully before putting her full weight on them, showing good sense that Caleb could appreciate even if he found everything else about her presence irritating. The door protested when she pushed it open, hinges screaming like wounded animals. Eliza disappeared into the dark interior, and for a moment Caleb considered simply riding away, leaving her to discover the full extent of the cabin's decay on her own. But something, duty maybe, or the faint echo of manners his wife had spent years instilling, kept him in place. He dismounted, tied Grant to a nearby tree, and followed Eliza into the cabin. Inside was worse than outside. 20 years of neglect had transformed the single-room structure into a monument to entropy. The floor had indeed rotted in places, creating dangerous soft spots that could give way beneath unwary feet. The walls were stained with water damage, and mold bloomed in the corners like dark flowers. The stone fireplace still stood, at least, the one element of the cabin that time couldn't easily destroy. But birds had nested in the chimney, and animal droppings suggested that various creatures had claimed the space as their own. Eliza stood in the center of it all, turning slowly, taking inventory. "I'll need to replace the floor entirely," she said, speaking more to herself than to Caleb. "And the roof? That's the priority. Can't do anything else until the roof is sound. The walls are still solid, though, good timber. They just need cleaning and treatment. The fireplace works, which means heat and cooking. That's half the battle right there." Caleb shook his head. "You're out of your mind." "Possibly." Eliza looked at him then, and he saw something in her expression that he recognized, though he'd never expected to see it reflected back at him. Stubbornness born of necessity, determination forged in the fires of having no other choice. "But I've made homes out of worse, Mr. Vance. I've slept in barns and tents, and once, memorably, in a chicken coop during a flood. This," she gestured around the ruined cabin, "this is just work. I know work. You can't do this alone. I've done everything alone for the past 3 years since my husband died. This won't be any different." The casual mention of her loss, delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone she'd used in the pasture, struck Caleb harder than he'd anticipated. 3 years. Not so different from his own timeline of isolation, though her solitude had been forced while his had been chosen. "The lumber alone," he started to say, but Eliza cut him off. "I have money saved. Not much, but enough for materials. And I'm handy with tools. My father was a carpenter before he was a farmer, and he made sure I knew my way around a hammer and saw. I'll manage." "In winter? You think you can rebuild a cabin in the middle of winter?" "I think I can make it habitable in winter, which is all I need. The rest can wait for spring." Caleb stared at her, this impossible woman who looked at ruins and saw potential, who spoke of rebuilding as if it were as simple as breathing. Part of him wanted to argue further, to point out all the ways this plan would fail, all the dangers she was courting. But another part, smaller, quieter, buried under years of practiced indifference, found himself almost impressed. "You'll need help with the roof," he heard himself say. Eliza's eyebrows rose slightly. I thought you didn't want to be involved. I don't, but if you fall through a rotten roof and die on my property, that's my problem. Legal complications I don't need. It was a lie, and they both knew it, but Eliza had the grace not to call him on it. I appreciate that, Mr. Vance. Purely for the legal complications, of course. Caleb, he said, surprising himself again, if you're going to be living on my land, we might as well dispense with the formalities. Eliza, then. She extended her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Caleb took it. Her grip was firm, her palm calloused, the hand of someone who worked rather than gestured, who acted rather than expected action on her behalf. The brief contact sent an unexpected jolt through Caleb's system, a reminder that he was still capable of physical sensation beyond pain and cold. He dropped her hand quickly, stepping back. I'll bring lumber tomorrow, he said gruffly, and tools. We'll assess the roof damage properly, then decide what needs to happen. We? I said I'd help. I didn't say I'd do it all for you. Eliza smiled then. Not a broad grin, but a small curve of her mouth that transformed her face from striking to something approaching beautiful. I wouldn't expect you to. Outside, Maple brayed loudly, the sound making both of them wince. Your donkey, Caleb said, needs to stay out of my business. I'll inform her of your preferences, Eliza replied, her smile widening fractionally. But I should warn you, Maple has historically shown little interest in human preferences. As if summoned, the donkey appeared in the doorway, blocking most of the light. She stared at Caleb with what could only be described as smugness, then turned and walked away, tail swishing. Caleb had the distinct impression he'd been judged and found wanting. I'll be back tomorrow at first light, he said, moving toward the door before he could say anything else he'd regret. Don't do anything stupid before then. Define stupid, Eliza called after him. But Caleb was already outside, untying Grant, mounting with more haste than grace, and riding away from the cabin and its new occupant as if pursued by something more dangerous than memory. He didn't look back. If he had, he would have seen Eliza standing in the doorway, watching him go with an expression that mixed amusement with something softer, recognition, maybe, or understanding. She'd seen men like Caleb before, men who'd built walls so high they'd forgotten what sunlight looked like, men who confused survival with living. She'd been married to one once, but she'd also learned that walls, no matter how high, always had foundations. And foundations could be undermined slowly, patiently, by someone willing to wait. Eliza turned back to the cabin, rolling up her sleeves despite the cold. She had work to do. Behind her, Maple brayed once more, a sound of pure, inexplicable triumph. That night, Caleb lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling of his house and cursing his own weakness. He should have said no and meant it, should have sent Eliza hard on her way, denied her the cabin, maintained the isolation that had served him perfectly well for 2 decades. Instead, he'd agreed. Worse, he'd volunteered to help. The woman had been on his property for less than an hour, and already she'd disrupted the careful equilibrium of his existence. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams he hadn't experienced in years. Not nightmares of loss, which were his usual companions, but something else. Something involving steady eyes, calloused hands, and the distant sound of a donkey's bray echoing across frozen pastures. He woke before dawn, as he always did, and found himself almost eager for the work ahead. It terrified him, but not enough to stay away. Caleb arrived at the cabin before sunrise, leading a second horse loaded with lumber, tools, and supplies he'd pulled from his barn, materials that had sat untouched for years, gathering dust and memories he'd stopped acknowledging. The morning air bit through his coat with familiar cruelty, but he barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, caught between irritation at his own involvement and something else he refused to name. When he reached the clearing, he found Eliza already awake, crouched beside a small fire she'd built in a cleared patch of snow. She'd somehow managed to drag a broken table from inside the cabin and was using it as a makeshift workbench, her tools laid out with military precision. Maple stood nearby, watching the proceedings with an expression that somehow managed to be both bored and judgmental. Eliza looked up at the sound of hooves, her face smudged with soot, but her eyes bright with the kind of energy that came from purposeful work. "You're early," she said. Sun's almost up. That's not early, that's normal. Caleb dismounted, beginning to unload the lumber. I brought what you'll need for the roof. Pine boards, tar paper, nails. Should be enough to make it weatherproof. How much do I owe you? We'll settle accounts later. He didn't want to discuss money, didn't want to think about the fact that he was essentially subsidizing this woman's invasion of his carefully maintained solitude. Show me the damage. They spent the next hour on the roof, Caleb's experienced eye cataloging every weakness, every point of failure. It was worse than he'd initially assessed. 3 major sections had rotted through completely, and the rest was compromised enough that a heavy snow could collapse the entire structure. This is at least a week's work, he said, more to himself than to Eliza. Maybe more. Then we'd better get started. There was no hesitation in her voice, no complaint about the magnitude of the task, just acceptance and readiness. Caleb found himself studying her as she examined a particularly damaged section, noting the way she assessed the problem with the same practical directness she seemed to apply to everything. You ever done roofing before? He asked. Patched a few barns back in Pennsylvania. Nothing this extensive, but the principle's the same. Keep the weather out. Keep the structure sound. Pennsylvania's a long way from here. Eliza glanced at him, and he saw the flicker of something in her expression. History, maybe, or pain long since metabolized into strength. Yes, it is. She didn't elaborate, and Caleb didn't push. They both understood the value of questions left unasked. They worked through the morning in near silence. The only sounds, the rasp of saws cutting lumber and the percussion of hammers driving nails. Caleb had forgotten what it felt like to work alongside someone, to share labor without needing to fill the spaces with meaningless conversation. Eliza matched his pace without complaint, her movements efficient and sure. When she didn't know how to do something, she watched him once, then replicated the action. No fuss, no false pride. It should have been awkward, this unexpected partnership. Instead, it felt almost natural, like rediscovering a skill he'd assumed was lost forever. Around midday, Maple decided to make her presence known. The donkey had been uncharacteristically quiet all morning, grazing peacefully near the tree line. But apparently, she'd grown bored with good behavior. Caleb was balanced on a ladder, securing a section of tar paper, when he heard Eliza's startled laugh below him. Maple, no, that's not yours. He looked down to see the donkey trotting away from their supply pile, a coil of rope clenched triumphantly in her teeth. Drop it, Eliza called, moving to intercept. Maple picked up speed, the rope trailing behind her like a trophy. Your donkey's stealing our materials, Caleb said flatly. I told you she's not my donkey, she's her own enterprise. Eliza broke into a run, chasing after Maple with surprising speed. Maple, we need that rope! The donkey, apparently finding this development hilarious, began to run in circles, kicking up snow and braying with what sounded distinctly like laughter. Eliza pursued, her earlier composure completely abandoned in favor of exasperated determination. Caleb watched from his perch on the ladder, something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. It took him a moment to identify the sensation. Amusement. He was amused. The realization was so startling that he nearly lost his grip on the ladder. When was the last time he'd found anything amusing? When was the last time he'd felt anything besides the gray numbness that had become his default state? Below, Eliza had given up the chase and was standing with her hands on her hips, glaring at Maple, who'd stopped running and was now standing just out of reach, still holding the rope. Fine, Eliza said to the donkey. Keep it. See if I care. We'll just have to tie everything down with twine instead, and when the roof blows off in the next storm, you'll be the one standing out in the rain. Maple considered this, her enormous ears swiveling forward. Then, with what appeared to be a donkey shrug, she walked back to Eliza and dropped the rope at her feet. Thank you, Eliza said with exaggerated politeness. Your cooperation is appreciated. Maple snorted and wandered off to investigate a patch of frozen grass. Caleb descended the ladder, shaking his head. That's the most ridiculous animal I've ever seen. She has character, Eliza defended, coiling the rescued rope. And personality. Those are rare qualities. They're inconvenient qualities. The best qualities usually are. Their eyes met, and Caleb realized she wasn't just talking about the donkey anymore. He looked away first, uncomfortable with the weight of understanding in her gaze. "We should eat something," he said gruffly. "Can't work all day on empty stomachs." Eliza had brought provisions: hard bread, cheese, dried apples, and coffee she brewed in a battered pot over her small fire. They sat on stumps she'd dragged from the forest, eating in companionable silence while Maple grazed nearby, occasionally glancing over as if checking to ensure they weren't doing anything interesting without her. "How long were you a midwife?" Caleb asked, surprising himself with the question. 15 years, give or take. Started when I was 30, after my second child was born. The woman who delivered her taught me the basics, said I had good hands for the work." Eliza took a sip of coffee, her expression distant with memory. "Lost that child to fever when she was 4, lost my son 2 years later to the same sickness. That's when I knew I needed to learn more than basics. Went to Philadelphia, studied with a real doctor for 6 months. Came back different." The casual recitation of loss, delivered without self-pity or dramatic pause, struck Caleb like a physical blow. 2 children. She'd lost 2 children and was sitting here, working on a broken cabin, discussing it as if it were simple history rather than ongoing devastation. "I'm sorry," he said, the words inadequate but genuine. Eliza looked at him, really looked at him, and he saw recognition in her eyes, the kind that came from understanding rather than assumption. "You've lost people too." It wasn't a question. Somehow she knew. Maybe she'd asked in town, or maybe she could simply see it in him, the way loss left marks invisible to everyone except those who carried similar scars. "Wife and 2 children," Caleb said, the words coming out rough and unpracticed. 20 years ago, fire took the house. I was in town, settling accounts with the feed supplier. Came home to ashes." He'd never said it out loud before, not like this. The few people who knew had learned through gossip or official records, never from his own mouth. But Eliza's quiet acknowledgement of her own grief had somehow created space for his, had made the confession feel less like exposure and more like exchange. "That's a long time to be alone," Eliza said softly. "It's what I chose." Choice and necessity aren't always different things. Before Caleb could respond to that, Maple wandered over and stuck her nose directly into Eliza's coffee cup, sniffing loudly. "No," Eliza said firmly, moving the cup out of reach. "Coffee's not for donkeys." Maple, undeterred, turned her attention to Caleb and attempted to eat his hat. "Your animal has no boundaries," he said, standing up quickly and rescuing his hat from the donkey's teeth. "Neither do you, apparently," Eliza replied, her tone light, but her eyes knowing. "You said you wanted nothing to do with tenants, yet here you are, spending your day fixing my roof." "Your roof is on my property. Structural failures reflect poorly on the landowner." "Of course. Purely a matter of reputation." She was mocking him gently, and Caleb knew it, but found he didn't particularly mind. There was something refreshing about her directness, her refusal to pretend his motivations were what he claimed them to be. They returned to work, and the afternoon passed in the same rhythm as the morning. Steady labor punctuated by Maple's periodic attempts to steal tools, eat building materials, or generally make her presence impossible to ignore. By the time the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they'd completed nearly a third of the roof, far more progress than Caleb had expected. "You're a fast worker," he observed as they secured the final board of the day. "I don't see the point in going slow when there's work to be done. Life's too short to waste time pretending to be delicate." Caleb climbed down from the roof, his muscles protesting after hours of unaccustomed labor. He was in good shape for his age, but roofing required different movements than his usual ranch work, and he'd feel this tomorrow. "I'll be back in the morning," he said, gathering his tools. "We should be able to finish the roof in 3, maybe 4 more days if the weather holds." "You don't have to keep helping," Eliza said, though her tone suggested she hoped he would. "I can manage from here. The roof's the most dangerous part. I'm not having you fall through and break your neck." He paused, then added, "Besides, I started this. Might as well see it through." "Is that what we're calling it? Seeing it through?" "What else would we call it?" Eliza smiled, that small curve of her mouth that transformed her face. "I suppose that depends on what it actually is." Caleb had no answer to that, So he mounted Grant and rode away, feeling her eyes on his back until the trees swallowed him up. The pattern continued for the next 4 days. Caleb would arrive at dawn, they would work until dusk, and slowly, methodically, the cabin began to transform from ruin to shelter. The roof was completed first, solid and weatherproof, no longer threatening to collapse with the next snowfall. Then they moved to the interior, replacing rotted floorboards, patching walls, cleaning out years of accumulated debris and animal nests. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them had weight and texture, was communication in its own language. Caleb found himself noticing things. The way Eliza's forehead creased when she was concentrating, the competent economy of her movements, the soft humming she sometimes produced while working, tunes he didn't recognize but found oddly soothing. And through it all, Maple was a constant, chaotic presence. The donkey seemed to have appointed herself supervisor of the reconstruction project, offering unsolicited opinions in the form of brays, investigating everything with her nose, and generally refusing to acknowledge that she wasn't the center of the universe. On the 4th day, while Caleb was reinforcing a window frame, Maple wandered up behind him and bit his coat. Not hard enough to hurt, but firmly enough to get his attention. Caleb turned, glaring at the donkey. "What?" Maple stared back, unblinking, then deliberately bit his coat again. "I think she likes you," Eliza called from across the room, where she was treating the walls for mold. "She has a terrible way of showing it." "Most worthwhile things do." Caleb wasn't sure if they were still talking about the donkey. That evening, as he prepared to leave, Eliza stopped him with a hand on his arm. The contact was brief, professional, but Caleb felt it like a brand. "Thank you," she said simply, "for all of this. You didn't have to help, but you did. That means something." "It's just a cabin." "No," Eliza said, her steady eyes holding his. "It's not." They both knew what she meant. The cabin was shelter, yes, but it was also proof that isolation could be breached, that walls could come down, that help could be accepted even when pride said otherwise. Caleb mounted Grant without responding, but as he rode away, he felt something shift inside him, a crack in the ice that had encased his heart for 20 years, small but undeniable. It terrified him, but not enough to stop coming back. The following week, with the cabin now habitable, Caleb told himself he had no reason to return. His obligation was fulfilled, the structure was sound, and Eliza had everything she needed to manage on her own. He'd done more than required, had spent more time with another human being than he had in 2 decades. It was time to retreat to his careful solitude. But on the 3rd day of staying away, he woke to find Maple standing on his porch. The donkey shouldn't have been there. Eliza's cabin was on the western edge of his property, a good 2 miles from the main house. Fence lines separated the areas along with dense forest and rough terrain. Yet somehow, impossibly, Maple had navigated all of it to appear at his door, looking entirely too pleased with herself. Caleb stared at the donkey through his window, coffee cup frozen halfway to his mouth. Maple stared back, then brayed loud enough to wake the dead. He opened the door, intending to shoo the animal away, only to have Maple walk directly into his house as if she'd been invited. "Absolutely not," Caleb said, blocking her path. "Out. Now." Maple attempted to eat his table. "I said out." The donkey ignored him, continuing her exploration of his kitchen with the confidence of a long-term resident rather than an intruder. It took Caleb 20 minutes of pushing, pulling, and creative cursing to get Maple back outside. By the time he succeeded, he was sweating despite the cold, his carefully maintained morning routine completely destroyed. He saddled Grant and rode to Eliza's cabin with the donkey following behind him like a stubborn, hairy shadow. Eliza was outside, chopping wood with steady, practiced strokes. She looked up at his approach, then saw Maple, and her expression shifted from pleasant surprise to resigned understanding. She got out again. "Again?" Caleb's voice rose dangerously. "How many times has this happened?" "She's escaped 3 times since we finished the cabin. I've repaired the fence each time, but she keeps finding new ways through, or over. I'm honestly not sure how she's doing it." Maple, as if proud of her accomplishments, walked directly to Eliza and nuzzled her shoulder. "You need better fences," Caleb said. "I have fences." She ignores them. It's like she doesn't understand the concept of boundaries. Then tie her up. I've tried. She chews through the rope. Use chain. I don't have chain, and frankly, Maple would probably find a way to pick locks if I used them. She's remarkably resourceful when she wants to be somewhere she's not supposed to be. Caleb dismounted, running a hand through his hair in frustration. She came to my house, walked right onto my porch like she owned the place. I'm sorry. I'll try to keep better watch on her. You can't watch her 24 hours a day. You have work to do. So what do you suggest? Eliza's tone was patient, but Caleb detected a hint of amusement underneath. Short of building a fortress, I'm not sure what else I can do. Build a fortress then. With what money? I spent most of my savings on cabin materials. They stared at each other, the problem of Maple hanging between them like an unresolved argument. The donkey, oblivious or uncaring of the trouble she'd caused, wandered over to investigate Caleb's saddlebags. I could reinforce your fences, Caleb heard himself say. Proper posts, better wire, something even a determined donkey can't breach. That's not your responsibility. It becomes my responsibility when your donkey invades my house. Eliza studied him with those knowing eyes. Is that really why you're offering? What other reason would there be? I can think of several. The air between them charged with something Caleb didn't want to name. He looked away first, focusing on Maple, who was now attempting to open his saddlebag with her teeth. I'll start on the fences tomorrow, he said gruffly. But you're helping, and you're providing lunch. Deal, Eliza said, extending her hand. When Caleb took it, the contact lasted a fraction longer than necessary, her calloused palm warm against his. He pulled back quickly, already regretting his offer but knowing he'd see it through. Because that's what he did. He kept his word. At least that's what he told himself. The fence project became the new routine. Caleb would arrive each morning, and together they would work on reinforcing the perimeter around Eliza's cabin, sinking posts deep into the frozen ground, stringing wire with enough tension to hold back anything short of a determined bear. Maple watched the proceedings with apparent interest, occasionally testing their work by leaning against new sections, as if quality checking their craftsmanship. During their lunch breaks, they began to talk more. Small revelations, carefully offered and received. Eliza told him about Pennsylvania, about the farm she'd left behind after her husband died, about the decision to come west because staying meant drowning in memories. Caleb found himself responding in kind, sharing things he'd never intended to share. About Sarah, who'd been able to make him laugh even when the ranch was failing. About his daughter, who'd inherited her mother's smile. About his son, who'd been learning to ride the summer before the fire. He talked about the night it happened, how he'd seen the smoke from town, how he'd ridden home faster than he'd ever ridden before, knowing even as he approached that he was too late. About finding their bodies, about burying them on the hill where Sarah had loved to watch the sunset. I stayed, he said, staring at the fence post he was securing. People thought I was crazy, said I should sell, start over somewhere else. But leaving felt like abandoning them, so I stayed. And slowly became a ghost yourself, Eliza said softly. Maybe. Definitely. She set down her hammer, looking at him directly. Caleb, I understand grief. I've lived with it, carried it, let it shape my decisions. But there's a difference between honoring loss and being buried by it. Staying alive isn't a betrayal of the dead. Easy to say. Nothing about it is easy, but it's still true. Before Caleb could respond, Maple decided to insert herself into the conversation by walking between them and flopping down directly on the fence section they'd just completed, her substantial weight bending the wire. Maple, Eliza exclaimed. Off! That's not a bed! The donkey rolled onto her side, looking supremely comfortable. Caleb stared at the destroyed work, then at the donkey, then at Eliza. And then, for the first time in 20 years, he laughed. It started as a chuckle, rusty and unpracticed, but grew into genuine laughter that seemed to come from somewhere deep and long forgotten. Eliza joined in, and for several minutes they stood there in the snow, laughing at the sheer absurdity of a donkey who'd just destroyed an hour's work and looked proud of it. When the laughter finally subsided, Caleb wiped his eyes, realizing with distant surprise that they were wet. That animal, he said, shaking his head. She's something special, Eliza agreed, her own eyes bright with mirth and something else Caleb couldn't quite identify. They rebuilt the fence section, this time with Maple safely relocated, and as they worked, Caleb felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Lightness. As if the laughter had somehow dislodged a weight he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was there. That evening, as he rode home, he realized he was already looking forward to tomorrow. The realization should have alarmed him. Somehow, it didn't. 2 weeks passed. The fences were completed, strong enough to contain even Maple, though the donkey still occasionally tested them with the dedication of an escape artist planning her next breakout. The cabin was now fully habitable, warm and weatherproof, transformed from ruin to home. Caleb told himself he had no more excuses to visit. Then a late winter storm rolled in, dumping 2 feet of snow in 36 hours and making the western pastures impassable. Caleb spent the first day of the storm tending his cattle, ensuring they had access to shelter and hay. The second day, he found himself staring toward the western edge of his property, wondering if Eliza was managing, if the cabin's new roof was holding, if she had enough firewood. By the third day, when the storm finally broke, he couldn't stand it anymore. He rode to her cabin, telling himself it was just neighborly concern, just basic human decency to check on someone after a major storm. The fact that he'd gone 3 winters without checking on anyone didn't factor into his rationalization. When he arrived, he found Eliza outside, clearing snow from her path with a shovel nearly as tall as she was. Maple stood nearby, wearing what appeared to be a knitted blanket tied around her middle, looking ridiculous and entirely unbothered by the fact. "Did you make your donkey a sweater?" Caleb called out. Eliza looked up, her face flushed from exertion but breaking into a smile at the sight of him. "She gets cold. And before you say anything, yes, I know it's absurd, but she's warmer, and that's what matters." "I wasn't going to say anything." "Yes, you were." "I was thinking it loudly." "That's the same thing." They grinned at each other, and Caleb felt that dangerous warmth spreading through his chest again, the sensation that was becoming increasingly familiar and increasingly difficult to ignore. "I came to check on you," he said, dismounting. "Make sure the cabin held up." "It held perfectly. Your roof didn't leak at all, and I had plenty of firewood and supplies." She paused. "But I'm glad you came anyway." The admission hung in the cold air between them, honest and unadorned. Caleb could have deflected, could have retreated behind gruff practicality. Instead, he found himself saying, "I'm glad I came too." Eliza's smile widened, transforming her face, and Caleb thought, not for the first time, that she was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness and everything to do with strength and survival and stubborn refusal to be broken. "Help me clear this path," she said, "and I'll make you the best coffee you've had in years." "That's a bold claim." "I make bold claims. It's one of my many talents." They worked together, clearing snow, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Maple supervised, occasionally wandering over to shake snow onto whoever was closest, as if sharing the wealth of winter. When they finally finished, Eliza made good on her promise. The coffee was indeed excellent, rich and strong, exactly how Caleb preferred it, though he'd never told her. They sat by her fireplace, warming their hands on the cups, and talked about everything and nothing. The weather, the ranch, the peculiarities of frontier life. And underneath it all, the unspoken acknowledgement that something had shifted between them, that friendship had bloomed in the unlikely soil of their shared isolation, that neither of them was quite as alone as they'd been before. As the afternoon light began to fade, Caleb stood reluctantly. "I should get back, check on the cattle." "Of course." Eliza walked him to the door. "Thank you for coming, for checking on me." "I was in the area." "Your ranch is in every area of your property. That's how property works." "You're mocking me again." "I've been mocking you since the day we met. You're just noticing now?" Caleb found himself smiling, despite his attempt to maintain composure. "I notice everything." "Do you?" Eliza's tone had shifted, become softer, and when Caleb looked at her, he saw something in her expression that made his heart stutter. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and risk. Caleb could have stepped back, could have retreated to safety. Instead, he found himself stepping closer. "Eliza," he started, not sure what he intended to say, But whatever words he might have found were interrupted by Maple, who chose that exact moment to bray directly behind him, the sound loud enough to wake the dead and startling enough to make Caleb jump. The spell broke. Eliza laughed, stepping back, and Caleb cleared his throat awkwardly. "Your donkey has terrible timing," he muttered. "She has perfect timing," Eliza corrected. "Just not for what you wanted." Caleb mounted Grant, looking down at Eliza, who stood in her doorway with Maple beside her, both of them watching him with expressions that were entirely too knowing. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said, then froze, realizing what he'd implied. "Will you?" Eliza's smile was gentle, teasing. "Any particular reason?" "The western fences need checking after the storm." "Of course they do." "They might be damaged." "They might be." "And you'll need help if they are." "I probably will." They looked at each other, and Caleb saw his own acknowledgement reflected in her eyes. They'd stopped pretending this was about fences or cabins or practical necessities. Something had grown between them, something neither had planned but both had allowed. "Tomorrow, then," Eliza said. "Tomorrow," Caleb agreed, and rode away feeling lighter than he had in 20 years. Behind him, Maple brayed once more, a sound that could have been triumph or approval or simply a donkey being herself. Caleb decided it didn't matter which. Tomorrow came, and the day after, and the one after that. The pattern of Caleb's life, so rigidly structured for 20 years, had been fundamentally altered by the presence of a stubborn woman and her even more stubborn donkey. He found himself inventing reasons to ride to the western cabin, checking fences that didn't need checking, delivering supplies Eliza hadn't requested, offering help with tasks she could easily manage alone. She never called him on it, though her knowing smile suggested she saw through every excuse. Instead, she simply accepted his presence, made him coffee, worked beside him when work existed, and talked with him when it didn't. Slowly, carefully, they were building something neither wanted to name but both had begun to need. 3 weeks into this new routine, Caleb made a decision that surprised even himself. He arrived at Eliza's cabin on a clear, cold morning and found her feeding Maple, who was making her usual production of the simple act of eating breakfast, braying between mouthfuls as if critiquing the quality of her hay. "I need help with the western fences," Caleb said without preamble. "The real ones, on the far boundary of the property. Storm damage weakened several sections, and with spring coming, the cattle will be moving to those pastures. It's a 2-day job, maybe 3. Eliza looked up from Maple's feeding trough, surprise flickering across her face. "You're asking me to help you?" "You said you knew your way around fence repair." "I do, but—" She stopped, studying him with those penetrating eyes that always seemed to see more than he intended to show. "This is different from helping with my cabin. This is your work, your ranch." "I'm aware of that." "So why ask me?" Caleb could have offered a dozen practical reasons. He could have cited efficiency, or claimed he needed an extra pair of hands, or invented some emergency that required assistance. Instead, he found himself speaking truth he barely understood. "Because I want to," he said simply. The admission hung between them, more vulnerable than any confession of need would have been. Eliza's expression softened and she nodded slowly. "All right then, when do we start?" "Now, if you're ready, we'll need to ride out early, work through the day. It's rough country out there." "I've handled rough country before." Eliza wiped her hands on her coat, already moving toward her cabin to gather supplies. "Give me 10 minutes. She emerged wearing practical riding clothes, her saddlebags packed with efficiency that spoke of long experience with frontier travel. Maple, apparently sensing abandonment, began braying with increasing volume and indignation. "You can't come," Eliza told the donkey firmly. "This is work, and you'll just get in the way." Maple's response was a bray so loud it startled a flock of birds from nearby trees. "She'll be fine," Caleb said, though he felt oddly sympathetic to the donkey's obvious distress. "She has food and water, and the fence will keep her contained." Famous last words, as it turned out. They rode west together, Eliza on a sturdy mare she'd purchased from a farmer in town, Caleb on Grant. The land grew progressively wilder as they traveled. the gentle slopes near the main ranch giving way to steeper terrain dotted with pine forests and rocky outcrops. Snow still lay thick in the shadows, though patches of bare ground had begun to appear where sunlight reached. Caleb found himself acutely aware of Eliza beside him. The easy way she sat her horse, the capable confidence with which she navigated difficult terrain, the occasional comments she made about the landscape that showed genuine appreciation for the harsh beauty of the frontier. "It's stunning out here," she said as they crested a ridge that overlooked a valley carved by centuries of snowmelt. "Brutal, but stunning." "That's Iron Ridge in 2 words," Caleb agreed. "Everything here is beautiful until it tries to kill you." Same could be said for most worthwhile things. Eliza glanced at him sidelong. "Including people." Caleb had no response to that, so he focused on guiding Grant down the ridge's far side, where the fence line began. When they reached it, the damage was immediately apparent. 3 posts had been knocked down, probably by falling trees during the winter storms, and the wire had been torn and tangled by the weight of accumulated ice. They dismounted and began the work of repair. Caleb had brought replacement posts, wire, and tools, and they fell into an easy rhythm. Caleb digging out the damaged posts while Eliza untangled the wire, then working together to set the new supports and restring the line. The physical labor was demanding, made more difficult by the cold ground and the awkward angles of the terrain. But there was something deeply satisfying about it, something almost meditative in the repetitive actions of building and repairing. They worked mostly in silence, but it was the comfortable quiet of people who didn't need constant conversation to feel connected. Around midday, they stopped to eat the lunch Eliza had packed. Sandwiches made from fresh bread she'd baked that morning, cheese, and apples that had survived the winter in cold storage. They sat on a fallen log, looking out over the valley while they ate. "You love this land," Eliza observed. "I can see it in the way you move through it, the way you talk about it." "It's all I have left," Caleb said, then corrected himself. "It was all I had left." The distinction wasn't lost on Eliza. She didn't comment on it directly, but her small smile suggested she understood what he was acknowledging, that his world, so carefully constricted for 20 years, had begun to expand again. "Tell me about when you first came here," she said, "before everything happened." So Caleb did. He told her about arriving in Iron Ridge as a young man with a new bride and more ambition than sense, about building the ranch from nothing, about the early years when every winter was a battle and every spring a hard-won victory. He told her about Sarah's determination to create a home in the wilderness, about teaching his children to ride, about the life they'd built together from raw land and stubborn hope. And Eliza listened, really listened, without interruption or false sympathy, letting him speak memories that had been locked away for 2 decades. When he finished, they sat in silence for a long moment. Then Eliza said quietly, "They'd be proud of you for surviving, for keeping the ranch going, for building something that lasted." "I'm not sure survival is worth being proud of." "It's the hardest thing there is," Eliza countered. "Dying is easy, Caleb. Staying alive when everything in you wants to give up. That's the real fight. That's what takes courage." Before Caleb could respond, a distant sound reached them, faint but growing louder. It took him a moment to identify it, and when he did, disbelief and reluctant amusement warred in his expression. Braying, getting closer. "No," he said flatly. "She couldn't have," Eliza breathed, standing up and looking back the way they'd come. But she had. Maple appeared over the ridge they'd crossed earlier, trotting toward them with the confident air of someone who'd accomplished exactly what she'd set out to do. Her knitted blanket was still tied around her middle, now decorated with pine needles and what appeared to be part of a bush. "How?" Caleb started, but Eliza was already moving toward the donkey, her expression caught between exasperation and horrified admiration. "Maple, how did you get out?" The donkey brayed triumphantly and nuzzled Eliza's shoulder, leaving a trail of slobber on her coat. Caleb walked over to examine the animal more closely. "There's no way she jumped that fence. It's too high." "She must have found a weak spot we missed. Or created one." Caleb noticed Maple's teeth had pieces of wood caught in them. "Did she chew through a fence post?" "Apparently determination and spite are more powerful than we anticipated." They stared at the donkey, who looked inordinately pleased with herself. The practical thing would be to turn back, to return Maple to her enclosure and try again to secure her properly. but they were already several hours into their work, and abandoning it now would mean starting over tomorrow. "She'll have to come with us," Eliza said, resignation clear in her voice. "That animal is a menace." "Yes, but she's a menace who apparently refuses to be left behind." Eliza stroked Maple's nose affectionately. "At least she's consistent." They returned to work, now with Maple as their uninvited supervisor. Surprisingly, the donkey seemed content to graze nearby, occasionally wandering over to investigate their progress, but mostly staying out of the way. It was almost peaceful, the three of them working in that wild valley, the only sounds the ring of hammer on post and the whisper of wind through pine. Late afternoon found them still working, the fence repair taking longer than Caleb had estimated due to the extent of the storm damage. They'd completed 2 sections, but had at least one more to go, and the light was beginning to fail. "We should make camp," Caleb said, eyeing the darkening sky. "Too dangerous to ride back in the dark through this terrain." Eliza nodded, showing no concern about spending the night outdoors. "There's a decent clearing about a quarter-mile back, sheltered, with a stream." "You notice that?" "I notice everything," she said, echoing his own words from weeks earlier. They set up camp with practiced efficiency. Caleb built a fire while Eliza tended to the horses and, inevitably, to Maple, who had decided the campsite met her exacting standards. The temperature was dropping rapidly as night fell, but the fire pushed back the cold, creating a bubble of warmth and flickering light. Eliza had brought provisions for an overnight stay, and they cooked a simple meal of beans and salt pork over the fire. It should have been awkward, this enforced intimacy, sharing a campfire and a meal in the middle of nowhere. Instead, it felt natural, as if they'd done this 100 times before. "I haven't camped out in years," Caleb admitted, watching sparks rise toward the darkening sky. "Used to do it regularly when I was younger, when the ranch needed constant attention. But after everything, I stayed close to the house. Afraid to be away from home? Maybe. Or maybe the house was the only thing keeping me anchored. Without it, I might have just drifted away entirely." Eliza poured coffee from the pot she'd set near the fire, handing him a cup. "But you didn't drift away. You're still here." "Physically present isn't the same as being alive." "No," she agreed, "but it's the necessary first step." They fell into comfortable silence, drinking their coffee and watching the fire. Maple had settled nearby, her ridiculous blanket making her look like some kind of mythical creature in the dancing shadows. Above them, stars emerged as the sky deepened to black, more stars than Caleb had seen in years, unobscured by clouds or indifference. "Do you ever regret coming here?" he asked suddenly. "To Iron Ridge, I mean. Leaving Pennsylvania, starting over in a place this hard?" Eliza considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I regret the circumstances that made it necessary, but the choice itself? No. Staying would have meant drowning in what I'd lost. Coming here, building something new, even something as simple as a cabin and a midwife practice, that's survival. That's choosing life. You make it sound simple. It's not simple. It's the hardest thing I've ever done." "But hard doesn't mean wrong." Caleb looked at her across the fire, this woman who'd invaded his carefully maintained isolation and refused to be intimidated by his walls or his wounds. The firelight painted her face in shades of gold and shadow, highlighting the strength in her features, the determination that had carried her through loss and across a continent to this frozen frontier. "I'm glad you came here," he said quietly. Eliza met his eyes, and the moment stretched between them, weighted with everything they'd shared and everything they'd carefully avoided saying. The fire crackled, Maple shifted in her sleep, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howled its loneliness to the indifferent stars. "So am I," Eliza finally said. They talked long into the night, about everything and nothing, their words creating a different kind of warmth than the fire provided. Caleb found himself telling stories he hadn't thought about in years, memories that had been locked away with his grief, but now emerged cautiously into the firelight. Eliza matched him story for story, her own past unfurling in anecdotes and observations that painted a picture of a woman who'd faced hardship with eyes wide open and refused to let it break her. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with them. Eliza had brought bedrolls, and they arranged them on opposite sides of the fire, maintaining respectful distance even as the cold encouraged closeness. Maple, naturally, positioned herself directly between them, as if she'd appointed herself chaperone. Caleb lay awake long after Eliza's breathing had evened into sleep, staring up at the stars and feeling something he hadn't experienced in 20 years. Hope. It was small, tentative, frightening in its fragility. But it was there, undeniable as the stars overhead. He fell asleep thinking about tomorrow, about the work they'd finished together, about the ride back to the ranch, about all the tomorrows that suddenly seemed worth anticipating. The sound that woke him wasn't gentle. It was urgent, violent, hoofbeats approaching at a speed that spoke of emergency or panic, or both. Caleb was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the rifle beside his bedroll, years of frontier instinct overriding the fog of sleep. Eliza woke equally fast, her movements controlled despite being startled from sleep. Maple, predictably, brayed indignantly at the disturbance. A rider emerged from the darkness into their firelight. A young man, barely 20, his face pale with terror and exhaustion. His horse was lathered with sweat despite the cold, its sides heaving. "Help!" the rider gasped, nearly falling from his saddle. "Please, you have to help. My wife, she's the baby." Eliza was moving before he finished speaking, her entire demeanor transforming from sleepy warmth to focused professionalism. "How far along is she?" 9 months, maybe more. I don't know. She started laboring yesterday morning, but something's wrong. She's been pushing for hours and nothing's happening, and there's so much blood." The words tumbled out in a panicked rush. "Where?" Eliza demanded, already pulling on her coat and boots. "Our cabin, about 3 miles north of here, near Copper Creek. Please, the town doctor is snowed in, can't make it out, and I didn't know what else to do. I was riding to Iron Ridge when I saw your fire." "I'm a midwife," Eliza said, cutting through his panic with calm authority. "I can help. Caleb, I'm coming with you," Caleb said, already saddling Grant. "You don't have to. I'm coming." Their eyes met over the fire, and Eliza nodded once, understanding what he wasn't saying, that he couldn't let her ride into danger alone, that after 20 years of isolating himself from human need, he was choosing differently now. They were mounted and moving within minutes, following the young man. His name was Thomas. He managed to gasp out between directions, through terrain that was treacherous even in daylight and potentially lethal in darkness. But Thomas knew the path, and desperation made him heedless of danger. Caleb rode close to Eliza, watching for hazards, his heart pounding with a fear that had nothing to do with the dangerous ride. He'd lost his own wife, his own children. The thought of Eliza walking into a situation where a woman and child hung between life and death, where her skills might not be enough, where everything could go wrong. He pushed the thought away and focused on riding. Behind them, impossibly, stubbornly, Maple followed, her brays of complaint echoing through the night. Thomas's cabin emerged from the darkness, a small structure, little more than a shack, lamplight spilling from its single window. Inside, they could hear screaming, raw animal sounds of pain that made Caleb's blood run cold. Eliza dismounted before her horse had fully stopped, grabbing the medical bag she always carried and striding toward the cabin with purpose. Caleb followed, uncertain what help he could offer, but unwilling to wait outside while life and death played out within. Inside, the scene was chaos. A young woman, little more than a girl, really, perhaps 19, lay on a narrow bed, her face contorted with agony, her shift soaked with sweat and blood. An older woman, probably a neighbor, hovered nearby looking helpless and terrified. Eliza took in the situation with one sweeping glance and immediately began issuing orders. "Boil water, as much as you can. I need clean cloth, torn into strips. She pointed at the older woman. "Help me get her positioned properly. Thomas, stay out of the way unless I call for you." Her voice cut through the panic like a blade, clear and commanding. Everyone moved to obey, grateful for someone who knew what to do, who radiated competence in the midst of catastrophe. Eliza washed her hands with soap and scalding water, then moved to examine the laboring woman. Caleb stood near the door, feeling useless, watching Eliza work with a combination of awe and terror. "How long has she been pushing?" Eliza asked the older woman while her hands moved with practiced efficiency, assessing the situation. 8 hours, maybe 9. The baby won't come. I've seen births before, but never like this. The baby's breech, Eliza said, her voice calm despite the gravity of the diagnosis. Feet first instead of head. That's why she can't deliver. Is there anything? Thomas's voice cracked with fear. I can turn the baby, Eliza said, her eyes never leaving her patient. But it's dangerous, risky for both mother and child. If we don't try, they'll both die. If we do try, we might save them both, or... She stopped, the unspoken alternative hanging in the air. Do it, the young woman gasped between contractions. Please, do whatever you have to. Save my baby. Eliza's jaw set with determination. Caleb, I need you. He moved instantly to her side. What do you need? When the next contraction comes, you're going to hold her shoulders. Keep her still no matter what. This is going to hurt her, badly, and she'll want to fight, but she can't move while I'm working. Can you do that? Caleb looked at the terrified young woman on the bed, at Eliza's steady eyes, and nodded. Yes. The next contraction came like a wave, and Caleb gripped the woman's shoulders gently but firmly. Eliza's hands moved with purpose, reaching, manipulating, turning the infant with a combination of skill and sheer determination that Caleb could barely comprehend. The woman screamed, a sound of such pure agony that it carved itself into Caleb's memory. He held firm, murmuring meaningless words of comfort, his own eyes burning with tears he couldn't afford to shed. Almost there, Eliza said, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cabin's chill. Just a little more. Then, with a movement so subtle Caleb almost missed it, something shifted. Eliza's expression changed, tension transforming into cautious hope. There, she breathed. Got it. The baby's turned. Now we wait for the next contraction, and you're going to push like your life depends on it, because it does. Understand? The young woman nodded weakly, gathering what remained of her strength. The next hour was a battle. Each contraction was a fight, each push a desperate bid for life. Caleb stayed at the woman's shoulders, holding her, supporting her, while Eliza worked with the focused intensity of someone for whom failure was not an option. Thomas paced near the door, praying or cursing or both. The older woman provided water, cloth, whatever Eliza demanded. And through it all, Eliza's hands never wavered, her voice never lost its calm authority, even as minutes stretched into an eternity of pain and effort and fear. Then, when Caleb had begun to fear that not even Eliza's skill would be enough, when the young woman's strength seemed finally depleted, a cry. Thin, reedy, impossibly precious, the sound of new life announcing itself to the world. Eliza caught the infant, her movements sure despite the blood and fluids, her face transformed by exhausted triumph. It's a girl, she said, her voice rough with emotion. You have a daughter. The woman on the bed laughed and sobbed simultaneously, reaching for her child with trembling hands. Eliza cleaned the infant quickly, efficiently, then placed her on her mother's chest, where tiny fingers curled and a small mouth sought instinctively for nourishment. But Eliza's work wasn't finished. There was still afterbirth to deliver, bleeding to control, a dozen small emergencies that could still turn victory into tragedy. She moved through each task with the same focused competence, and Caleb found himself helping without being asked, anticipating needs, providing support. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Eliza stepped back. The young mother was pale but stable, her daughter nursing successfully, both of them alive against considerable odds. She needs rest, Eliza said to Thomas, who'd been hovering anxiously, and fluids, broth, water, anything you can get her to drink. I'll stay tonight, make sure there are no complications. Thank you, Thomas said, the words utterly inadequate for what Eliza had done. I don't know how to... We can't pay much, but... We'll worry about payment later, Eliza said gently. Right now, focus on your wife and daughter. She moved to the small wash basin, scrubbing blood from her hands and arms with methodical thoroughness. Caleb could see exhaustion in every line of her body, but also something else. Satisfaction, purpose, the deep fulfillment that came from work that mattered. He stepped outside, needing air, needing space to process what he'd just witnessed. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, dawn approaching with its promise of a new day. He stood there, breathing cold air, feeling his hands shake with residual adrenaline. Eliza joined him a few minutes later, wrapping her coat tighter against the morning chill. That was, Caleb started, then stopped, unable to find words adequate to what he'd seen. That was a close thing, Eliza said quietly. Another hour, maybe less, and we would have lost them both. But we didn't. You didn't. He turned to face her. You saved them, both of them. We saved them, Eliza corrected. I couldn't have done it without you holding her steady. I just held her shoulders. You're the one who... He gestured helplessly toward the cabin. You turned that baby. You brought her into the world. You commanded that entire situation like someone who's done this before, Eliza finished. Because I have, many times. This is what I do, Caleb. This is who I am. He stared at her, truly seeing her perhaps for the first time. Not just as the stubborn woman who'd invaded his property, not just as the capable partner who'd helped rebuild his fences, but as this, someone who fought death and won, who brought life into the world with her bare hands and refused to accept defeat. You're remarkable, he said, the words escaping before he could stop them. Eliza's expression softened. I'm practical. There's a difference. No, Caleb said firmly. There isn't, not in this case. They stood together in the growing light, and Caleb felt something fundamental shift inside him, the final wall crumbling, the last defense falling away. He'd survived 20 years by refusing to feel, by keeping everyone at a distance, by convincing himself that isolation was safety. But watching Eliza fight for life, seeing her courage and skill and absolute refusal to give up, he understood that survival wasn't enough. That living, really living, meant accepting risk, meant opening yourself to the possibility of loss because the alternative was a kind of death in itself. Maple wandered up to them, having apparently appointed herself their permanent shadow. The donkey nuzzled Eliza's hand, then Caleb's, as if offering her own approval of the night's work. Your donkey followed us, Caleb said. She's not my donkey, Eliza replied automatically, but she was smiling. She's definitely your donkey. But then she's a donkey with terrible boundaries and no sense of when she's not wanted. Caleb looked at Eliza, at Maple, at the cabin behind them where new life slept peacefully. Maybe being wanted isn't about permission. Maybe it's about just showing up anyway. Eliza's eyes met his, and he saw understanding there, recognition of what he was really saying. Maybe it is, she agreed softly. The sun broke over the horizon then, painting the frozen landscape in shades of gold and rose, transforming the harsh wilderness into something approaching beautiful. Caleb stood beside Eliza, with her impossible donkey between them, and felt something he thought he'd lost forever. Hope. Connection. The terrifying, wonderful possibility of a future that included more than just survival. He didn't say any of that. He didn't need to. Some things were better felt than spoken. They stayed at Thomas's cabin through the morning, Eliza monitoring mother and child, while Caleb helped with practical matters, chopping wood, drawing water, making himself useful in the ways he understood. Around midday, satisfied that both patients were stable, Eliza finally agreed to leave. The ride back to their abandoned campsite was quiet, both of them lost in thought, processing the intensity of the night's events. They collected their belongings, extinguished the fire they'd left burning, and continued toward Eliza's cabin, exhaustion making every mile feel like 10. When they finally arrived, the sun was setting again, a full day having passed since they'd left. Maple immediately headed for her feeding trough, braying complaints about the delayed service. Eliza dismounted with visible effort, her body protesting after hours in the saddle following a sleepless night of intense work. I should go, Caleb said, though he found himself reluctant to leave. Let you rest. Stay, Eliza said, the single word carrying more weight than its brevity suggested. Just for a while. I'll make coffee. So he stayed. They sat by her fire, drinking coffee that was more necessity than pleasure, too tired for extensive conversation but finding comfort in shared silence. Last night, Eliza said eventually, staring into her cup, when I was trying to turn that baby, there was a moment when I thought I couldn't do it, that my hands weren't strong enough, or my skill wasn't sufficient, or the situation was just too far gone. And in that moment, you were there, steady, certain. It helped more than you know. You would have managed without me. Maybe. Or maybe we're stronger together than either of us is alone. She looked up at him. Did you ever consider that? Caleb had considered it. Had been considering it for weeks now, though he'd been afraid to acknowledge the thought fully. But after last night, after watching life triumph over death, after feeling the fierce connection forged in crisis. Yes, he admitted, I've considered it. And it terrifies me. Eliza set down her coffee cup, her expression understanding rather than hurt. Because you're afraid of losing someone again. I buried everyone I loved once. I'm not sure I could survive doing it again. So your plan is to never love anyone? To live alone until you die just to avoid the possibility of pain? It's kept me alive this long. No, Eliza said gently but firmly. It's kept you breathing. That's not the same thing as being alive. Caleb knew she was right. Had known it for weeks, maybe longer. The question was whether knowing was enough to change him, whether awareness could transform into action, whether fear could be overcome by something stronger. He looked at Eliza, strong, capable, beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with conventional beauty and everything to do with the force of her spirit. She'd suffered her own losses, carried her own grief, yet she'd chosen to keep living, keep fighting, keep showing up. She'd chosen courage over safety. And maybe, Caleb thought, it was time he did the same. I should go, Caleb said again, though he still didn't move. The words had become almost ritual at this point, a way of maintaining the illusion of boundaries that had already been crossed. Eliza stood, exhaustion evident in every movement, and walked him to the door. Outside, full darkness had fallen, the kind of deep black that only existed far from any town, any other human habitation. Stars scattered across the sky like thrown diamonds, indifferent and eternal. Thank you, she said quietly, for coming with me last night, for staying. I didn't do anything. You did everything that mattered. She reached out, her hand finding his in the darkness, squeezing once before letting go. Sleep well, Caleb. He rode home through the night, Grant picking his way carefully along familiar paths while Caleb's mind replayed the past 24 hours in vivid detail. The ride to Thomas's cabin, the desperate fight for life, the moment when that newborn's cry had split the darkness, and through it all, Eliza's steady presence, her unwavering competence, her absolute refusal to accept defeat. When he reached his own house, empty and silent as always, it felt different. Not smaller exactly, but lonelier. For 20 years, solitude had been his refuge. Now it felt like exile. He lay in bed, exhausted but unable to sleep, his mind too full of thoughts that had been carefully suppressed for 2 decades. Thoughts about connection, about purpose, about the difference between existing and living. Thoughts about a woman with calloused hands and steady eyes who'd somehow slipped past every defense he'd spent years constructing. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams not of fire and loss, but of possibility. The next morning, Caleb woke with unusual purpose. He moved through his routine chores with efficiency born of long practice, but his mind was elsewhere, planning, considering, making decisions that felt both reckless and overdue. He'd spent 20 years maintaining his ranch alone, doing only what was necessary to keep it functional. The house had fallen into disrepair beyond his basic needs. Rooms he didn't use had been closed off, repairs deferred, improvements abandoned. It had been enough when survival was his only goal. But somewhere during the past weeks, survival had stopped being enough. Caleb spent that day truly looking at his property for the first time in years. The house needed work, extensive work. The porch sagged, several windows were cracked. The paint had weathered to bare wood in places. Inside was worse. Furniture that had belonged to Sarah still sat exactly where it had been the day she died, covered now in dust and neglect. The kitchen, once the heart of their home, had been reduced to the bare minimum he needed to prepare his solitary meals. It was a monument to stasis, to a man who'd stopped living and started simply occupying space. The realization should have been devastating. Instead, Caleb felt something almost like relief. Because awareness was the first step toward change, and change, terrifying as it was, had begun to feel necessary. He started small. He cleaned the kitchen properly, scrubbing surfaces that hadn't been thoroughly cleaned in years. He opened windows to air out rooms that had been closed too long. He made a list of repairs, Not all of them, that would take months, but the most critical ones. The work felt strange after so long, almost like awakening muscles that had atrophied from disuse. 3 days passed before he rode back to Eliza's cabin. 3 days during which he told himself he was giving her space to recover from their ordeal, giving himself time to think, to plan, to figure out what he was actually doing. The truth was simpler and more complicated. He was afraid. Afraid of what it meant that he'd started fixing his house. Afraid of the hope that had taken root despite his best efforts to remain safely numb. Afraid of wanting something again after 20 years of wanting nothing. But fear, he was learning, didn't have to be paralyzing. It could be acknowledged and still overcome. When he finally rode up to Eliza's cabin, he found her outside, splitting wood with the kind of methodical determination he'd come to associate with her. Maple stood nearby, wearing a different knitted blanket. This one appeared to be striped, and watching the proceedings with her usual air of superior judgment. Eliza looked up at the sound of hooves, and her face transformed with a smile that hit Caleb like a physical force. 3 days, she said, driving her axe into the chopping block and walking toward him. I was beginning to think you'd decided to go back to being a hermit. I was working on the house. Something shifted in Eliza's expression, a flicker of understanding that suggested she knew exactly what that meant. Were you? It needed attention. I've been neglecting it. And you decided, after 20 years, that now was the time to start caring about it again? Caleb dismounted, meeting her eyes directly. Yes. The single word carried weight, acknowledgement of everything he wasn't quite ready to say explicitly. Eliza heard it. He could tell by the way her expression softened, by the slight curve of her mouth that wasn't quite a smile but was close. Well then, she said, I suppose I should come see what you've accomplished. It's not much yet, just cleaning, mostly, some minor repairs. Still, I'd like to see it. Your home. She paused, then added, if you're willing to show me. It was a test, Caleb realized, an offer to cross a threshold he'd kept locked for 2 decades. His house had been his sanctuary, his fortress against the world. No one had entered it since the day of the fire, except him. Inviting Eliza in would be an admission, a declaration that his isolation was ending. I'd like that, he said, and meant it. They rode together to his ranch, Maple trailing behind with her usual determination to be included in everything. The journey gave Caleb time to second-guess his decision approximately 50 times, but he pushed the doubts aside. He'd committed to this. To her. To the possibility of something beyond mere survival. When they reached his house, Caleb saw it through Eliza's eyes and felt a surge of embarrassment. Yes, he'd cleaned. Yes, he'd made some repairs. But it was still obviously the home of a man who'd been living half a life, going through motions without purpose. Eliza dismounted and stood looking at the structure for a long moment. Caleb braced himself for criticism, for judgment, for confirmation that inviting her here had been a mistake. Instead, she said quietly, It's a good house. Strong bones. You built this? Sarah and I built it together. I did the heavy work, but she planned it, designed the layout, chose where every window should go to catch the light. She had good instincts. The placement is perfect. Eliza walked up the sagging porch steps, testing each board carefully. This needs replacing. I know. It's on the list. A long list, I imagine. Very long. She turned to look at him, one hand resting on the doorframe. Are you going to invite me in, or should I just stand out here cataloging exterior repairs? Caleb climbed the steps and opened the door. Come in. The interior was dim, curtains still drawn in most rooms, but cleaner than it had been in years. Eliza moved through the space with quiet attention, not commenting on the closed doors or the obvious neglect, just observing. When she reached the kitchen, she stopped, running her hand along the heavy wooden table that dominated the room. You made this, she said. Not a question. How did you know? It has your character, solid, well-crafted, built to last. She pulled out a chair and sat down, the gesture so natural it was as if she'd done it 100 times before. Tell me about her, about Sarah. Caleb had avoided speaking Sarah's name for so long that saying it felt like relearning a forgotten language, but he found himself sitting across from Eliza at the table he'd built with his own hands, in the kitchen his wife had designed, and talking about the woman he'd loved and lost. He told Eliza about Sarah's laugh, which had been loud and unrestrained and completely infectious, about her terrible singing voice and her excellent cooking, about the way she'd insisted on planting flowers around the house every spring, even though the harsh climate killed most of them, because she believed beauty was worth fighting for. He told her about their children, Emma, who'd been 8 and already showing signs of her mother's stubborn determination, and Michael, who'd been 6 and had loved horses with a passion that had filled Caleb with plans for their future together. And he told her about the day he'd lost them, the details he'd never spoken aloud, the memories that had haunted him for 20 years. Eliza listened without interruption, her presence steady and accepting. When he finally fell silent, she reached across the table and took his hand. "They were lucky to have you," she said, "and you were lucky to have them. That doesn't end just because they're gone." "It feels like betrayal," Caleb admitted, the confession raw and painful. "To move forward, to want anything beyond what I had with them." "Is that what you think? That loving them means you have to stop living?" Eliza's grip on his hand tightened. "Caleb, they wouldn't want that. No one who truly loves someone wants them to spend the rest of their life as a monument to grief. You don't know that." "I do, actually, because when my husband died, when my children died, I had to make the same choice. Stay frozen in that moment of loss, or find a way to keep going. And I knew that they would want me to choose life, even if it hurt, even if it felt like betrayal, because the alternative is a different kind of death." Her words struck something deep inside Caleb, a truth he'd been avoiding for 2 decades. Sarah would have been furious to see what he'd become, how he'd let grief consume him, how he'd turned their home into a mausoleum. She'd have told him to stop being stubborn, to let people in, to remember that isolation wasn't strength, it was just fear wearing a different mask. "I don't know how," he said quietly. "I've been alone so long, I don't remember what it's like to what? To let someone matter." Eliza smiled, sad and understanding. "You already have, Caleb. You just haven't admitted it yet." She was right, of course. He'd been letting her matter for weeks now, fighting it the entire time, constructing elaborate justifications for why he helped her, why he sought her company, why the thought of her leaving made something twist painfully in his chest. What if I'm not capable of it anymore? The question came out barely above a whisper. What if 20 years of isolation broke something essential? "Then we'll figure out how to fix it," Eliza said simply. "Together." The word hung in the air between them, full of promise and possibility and risk. Together. Not alone, not isolating themselves in separate corners of existence, but actually connecting, building something, choosing each other. It was terrifying. It was also exactly what Caleb wanted. Outside, Maple brayed loudly, shattering the moment with her usual impeccable timing. Eliza laughed, the sound breaking the tension that had built in the kitchen. "Your donkey is demanding attention," Caleb said. "She's not my—" Eliza stopped, shaking her head with amusement. "Actually, at this point, I think she might be. She's certainly decided she belongs with us." "With us," Caleb echoed, testing the phrase. "Is that all right?" Eliza asked, her tone light but her eyes serious. "The us part?" Caleb stood, still holding her hand, drawing her up to face him. They were close now, close enough that he could see the fine lines around her eyes, the small scar on her chin, the silver threads woven through her dark hair. Close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her despite the cold that seemed to permeate everything in Iron Ridge. "Yes," he said. "It's all right." Eliza's smile was brilliant, transformative. She stepped closer, and Caleb found himself doing the same, drawn by gravity or fate or simple human need. When their lips met, it was gentle, tentative, like remembering a language forgotten but never truly lost. It lasted only a moment before Maple's brain intensified, accompanied by what sounded like the donkey trying to open the front door. They broke apart, both laughing now. The absurdity of being interrupted by a donkey, somehow perfect for this moment, this beginning. "I should probably stop her before she breaks in," Eliza said, though she didn't immediately move away. "Probably. Your porch is already in questionable condition." Very questionable. And Maple has a documented history of property destruction. Extensively documented. They stood there, neither willing to be the first to step back, until Maple apparently succeeded in her goal because the front door swung open and the donkey trotted into the house as if she'd been invited. Absolutely not, Caleb said, finally releasing Eliza and moving to intercept the intruder. Out! This is not a barn. Maple responded by walking directly to the kitchen and investigating the stove with intense interest. She has opinions about your cooking arrangements, Eliza observed. She can keep her opinions outside. It took both of them to herd Maple back through the door, the donkey protesting the entire way with brays that surely echoed across the entire valley. Once she was finally evicted, Caleb closed the door firmly and turned to find Eliza watching him with unconcealed amusement. This is going to be our life, isn't it? He said, constantly evicting that donkey from places she doesn't belong? Most likely. I can't believe I'm accepting this. You're accepting a lot of things, Eliza said, stepping close again. A troublesome donkey is probably the least of them. True. Caleb reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear with a tenderness that surprised them both. I'm accepting that I want you in my life, in my home, that I'm tired of being alone. Those are significant acceptances. What about you? What are you accepting? Eliza considered the question seriously. I'm accepting that I found something here I wasn't looking for. That this ranch, this place, this stubborn rancher who pretended not to need anyone, it feels like home. More than anywhere has felt since I lost my family. You could stay, Caleb said, the words emerging before he could overthink them. Not just in the cabin, here, with me. Caleb, I know it's fast, I know we've only known each other a few weeks, but I also know that I'm 50 years old, and I've wasted 20 years being afraid. I don't want to waste any more. He took her hands in his, holding tight. Stay, please. Eliza's eyes shone with emotion. Happiness, fear, hope, all mixed together in an expression Caleb understood completely because he felt the same way. I have patients in town, she said slowly. People who depend on me. I can't just abandon my practice. So keep it. Ride to town when you're needed. Stay here when you're not. It's not that complicated. It's extremely complicated. Then we'll figure out the complications together. She studied him for a long moment, and Caleb forced himself to wait, to let her think, to not push. This had to be her choice, freely made, or it would mean nothing. Finally, Eliza nodded. All right. Yes. I'll stay. The relief that flooded through Caleb was so intense, it was almost painful. He pulled her close, holding her against him, feeling her warmth, her solidity, the reality of her presence that proved this wasn't a dream or a fantasy, but actual possibility. They stood like that for a long time. Two people who'd survived their separate losses finding unexpected shelter in each other. Outside, Maple brayed her approval, or possibly her continued indignation at being excluded. Either way, it sounded distinctly triumphant. The weeks that followed were a study in adjustment and transformation. Eliza didn't move into the main house immediately. They both agreed that some transitions needed to happen gradually. Instead, she continued living in her cabin while spending increasing amounts of time at Caleb's ranch, helping with repairs, sharing meals, slowly weaving their separate lives into something shared. They worked on the house together, room by room, opening spaces that had been closed for years, letting light back into corners that had lived in shadow. Caleb found himself telling stories about each room as they cleaned and repaired, which chair had been Sarah's favorite, where Emma had hidden during games of Seek, the corner where Michael had practiced drawing horses. Eliza listened to all of it without trying to erase the past or pretend it hadn't existed. She understood that honoring his first family wasn't incompatible with building something new. The past and present could coexist, each making space for the other. Word spread in town about the arrangement, as word always did in small communities where everyone knew everyone's business. Some people approved, some disapproved, most simply accepted it as the natural outcome of two lonely people finding each other. Eliza continued her midwife practice, riding to town several times a week, building a reputation for competence and reliability that made her services increasingly in demand. Caleb found himself accompanying her sometimes, rediscovering the social interactions he'd avoided for 20 years. It was awkward at first, relearning how to talk to people, how to exist in community rather than isolation. But with Eliza beside him, it became bearable, then tolerable, then almost pleasant. He started helping her with difficult cases, his steady presence and physical strength proving useful in situations where she needed someone to hold a patient still, or lift something heavy, or simply provide moral support. They became known as a partnership, both professionally and personally, two people who functioned better together than either did alone. And through it all, Maple was a constant, chaotic presence. The donkey had somehow claimed both properties as her domain, wandering freely between Eliza's cabin and Caleb's ranch as if she owned both. She continued to escape from every enclosure they built, to interrupt important moments with her brain, to generally make herself impossible to ignore. Caleb complained about it constantly. He also, despite his protests, found himself oddly fond of the ridiculous animal. One evening, about 2 months after Eliza had agreed to stay, they were sitting on Caleb's repaired porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Maple grazed nearby, for once relatively quiet. "I got a letter from a doctor in Copper Falls," Eliza said, her tone carefully casual. "He wants to retire, looking for someone to take over his practice. It's a larger town, more patients, more resources, better opportunities." Caleb felt his stomach drop. "Are you considering it?" "I should consider it. It's exactly the kind of opportunity I would have jumped at 6 months ago." "But?" Eliza turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the sunset's colors. "But 6 months ago, I didn't have a reason to stay in Iron Ridge. Now I do." "Eliza, I don't want to hold you back." "You're not holding me back. You're giving me something to stay for. There's a difference." She took his hand, threading her fingers through his. "I'm not leaving, Caleb. This is home now. You're home." The words settled into Caleb's chest, warm and certain. He pulled her closer, kissing her temple, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling grateful in a way he hadn't felt since before the fire. "I love you," he said, the words emerging naturally without planning or rehearsal. Eliza smiled against his shoulder. "I know, I've known for weeks. You're not as subtle as you think. You could have said something. I was waiting for you to figure it out." She pulled back to look at him. "I love you too, by the way. In case that wasn't obvious." It was reasonably obvious. Only reasonably? "Well, you do have excellent poker face. It's one of your more intimidating qualities." "I have intimidating qualities?" "Several. Your competence is terrifying. Your ability to remain calm in crisis is unnerving, and your donkey is a menace." "She's your donkey too now," Eliza pointed out. "We're a package deal." As if summoned by the mention, Maple wandered over and stuck her nose between them, sniffing Caleb's coat pocket where he'd put an apple earlier. "Boundaries," Caleb told the donkey firmly. "We've discussed this." Maple ignored him completely and continued her investigation. "She doesn't respect your authority," Eliza observed. "She doesn't respect anyone's authority. It's her defining characteristic." "True, but she likes you anyway. I can tell." "How can you possibly tell?" "She bites you less than she used to." "That's not affection. That's tolerance." For Maple, tolerance is affection. Caleb had to concede the point. He extracted the apple from his pocket and offered it to the donkey, who accepted it with a gentleness that belied her usual chaos. As she crunched contentedly, he found himself smiling. "I never thought I'd end up here," he said quietly, "sitting on my porch with a woman I love and a donkey I barely tolerate, actually looking forward to tomorrow." "Barely tolerate?" Eliza's tone was amused. "Fine. A donkey I grudgingly appreciate. Better. A donkey who is growing on me against my will. There we go." They sat in comfortable silence as the sunset deepened, the sky turning from orange to purple to the deep blue that preceded full darkness. Stars began to emerge one by one, the same indifferent stars that had witnessed Caleb's grief and isolation, now witnessing his tentative return to life. "What happens next?" Eliza asked eventually. "What do you mean?" "With us. Where do we go from here?" Caleb considered the question. 6 months ago, he would have said there was no future worth considering, that his life was essentially over, except for the formality of continuing to breathe. Now, with Eliza's hand in his and the night settling around them like a promise, the future felt full of possibility. "I don't know," he admitted. "I haven't thought that far ahead in 20 years. Maybe it's time to start." "Maybe it is." He squeezed her hand. "What do you want?" "Honestly, I want this. This porch, this ranch, this life we're building. I want to keep practicing midwifery, keep helping people. I want to wake up next to you and fall asleep beside you and face whatever challenges come with someone who won't run when things get difficult." "I'm not running," Caleb said firmly. "I know. That's why I'm staying." They kissed again, slowly this time, without urgency, but with the certainty of two people who'd found something worth keeping. When they finally pulled apart, Maple had wandered off, apparently bored with their lack of attention to her needs. "She'll be back," Eliza predicted. "She always comes back. Like me. Like you." Caleb stood, drawing Eliza up with him. "It's getting cold. Come inside. I'll make dinner." "You cook now?" "I'm learning. Badly. But I'm learning." "Then I should definitely stay to supervise, for safety reasons. My cooking isn't dangerous. Your coffee suggests otherwise." "My coffee is perfect." "Your coffee could strip paint." They continued the gentle argument as they moved inside, Maple following at a distance, the three of them becoming what they'd been slowly becoming for months now. A unit, a family, something neither Caleb nor Eliza had expected to find in the frozen frontier of Iron Ridge. That night, after dinner and conversation and the easy domesticity of two people learning to share space, Eliza stayed. Not in a guest room, not as a visitor, but in Caleb's room, in his bed, in his arms. It felt right in a way that erased any doubt about the speed of their relationship or the wisdom of their choices. They fit together, two broken pieces that somehow formed something whole, something stronger than either would have been alone. As Caleb drifted toward sleep, Eliza's warmth beside him, and Maple's occasional braying drifting through the window, he felt something he'd thought lost forever: peace. Not the empty peace of numbness, but the deep contentment of someone who'd found purpose again, connection again, a reason to greet each day with something approaching eagerness. He'd survived 20 years of isolation by convincing himself that survival was enough. Now finally, he understood that it had never been enough, that living, really living, required risk and vulnerability and the courage to let someone matter despite knowing they could be lost. It required choosing love over safety, and for the first time in 2 decades, Caleb Vance had made that choice. Outside, the wind howled across Iron Ridge, cold and relentless as always. But inside, wrapped in warmth and possibility, Caleb barely heard it. He was too busy being alive. Spring arrived in Iron Ridge the way it always did, grudgingly, fighting for every inch of ground against winter's stubborn refusal to release its grip. Snow melted in patches, revealing brown grass that would eventually turn green, and the air lost some of its knife-edge sharpness, though frost still painted the mornings white. Caleb woke to sunlight streaming through windows he'd once kept perpetually curtained, to the warmth of another person beside him, to sounds of life-filling spaces that had been silent for 20 years. Eliza had fully moved into the main house 2 weeks earlier, bringing with her the few possessions she valued and the many skills that had already transformed his existence. The house itself had undergone a metamorphosis. What had been a mausoleum was now a home again, clean, repaired, filled with light and purpose. Eliza had insisted they keep Sarah's touches, the design elements she'd chosen, the memories embedded in walls and door frames. But she'd also added her own presence, not erasing the past, but weaving something new alongside it. Caleb had worried it would feel like betrayal. Instead, it felt like honoring Sarah's memory by refusing to let grief win, by choosing to live fully rather than exist partially. He slipped out of bed carefully, trying not to wake Eliza, and dressed in the pre-dawn darkness. The cattle needed tending, fences needed checking, and a dozen other tasks waited with the patience of routine. But as he moved through the house, he found himself smiling, a sensation that still felt new enough to be remarkable. In the kitchen, he started coffee, the rich smell filling the space while he looked out the window toward the eastern pasture. Movement caught his eye, and he sighed. Maple was on his porch again. The donkey had made it her mission to be involved in every aspect of their lives, whether invited or not. She'd somehow learned that Caleb usually woke first, and had taken to appearing at the house each morning, demanding attention, treats, or simply acknowledgement of her existence. Caleb opened the door, and Maple pushed her nose against his chest, snuffling loudly. "You're ridiculous," he told her, but his hand was already moving to scratch behind her ears in the spot she particularly liked. "And you smell like a barn." Maple responded with a soft sound that might have been contentment or complaint. With her, it was often difficult to tell the difference. "Talking to the donkey again?" Eliza's voice came from behind him, still rough with sleep. Caleb turned to find her wrapped in a blanket, her hair loose around her shoulders, looking more beautiful than anyone had a right to look in the early morning. "She started it," he said. "She always starts it." Eliza moved to join him, leaning against his side while they both watched Maple investigate the porch railing for edible options. "I had a thought. Should I be worried?" "Probably." Eliza smiled up at him. "My lease on the Western cabin expires at the end of the month. I was thinking we could convert it into a proper medical clinic. Nothing fancy, but somewhere I could see patients who can't make it to town, store supplies, maybe even handle minor emergencies." Caleb considered the idea. The cabin had served its purpose as Eliza's temporary home, but its real value had been in bringing her into his life, transforming it into something useful, something that served the community, felt right. "We'd need to expand it," he said, his mind already working through the logistics. "Add a second room at least, maybe a covered porch for waiting patients, better windows for light, a proper stove." "So you're agreeing?" "I'm agreeing, on one condition." Eliza raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" "You let me help build it, properly. Not just lending tools and materials, but actual partnership." I wouldn't have it any other way." They kissed, morning breath and all, Maple braying her opinion on their display of affection. When they separated, Caleb found himself grinning like a fool. "What?" Eliza asked. "I'm happy," he said simply. "It's still strange to say that after so long, but I am." "Good. You deserve to be." She squeezed his hand, then released it. "Now, I need to ride to town this morning. Thomas sent word his wife wants me to check on the baby. And Mrs. Henderson is due any day now, so I should probably be available." "Take Grant," Caleb offered. "He's steadier than your mare on the town road." "I can manage my own horse." "I know you can, but Grant knows the way blindfolded, and if you get called to an emergency, you'll be grateful for his reliability." Eliza studied him for a moment, and he saw the flicker of emotion in her eyes, recognition that his offer was about care, not doubt in her capabilities. "All right, thank you." She went to prepare for the ride while Caleb saw to his morning chores. Maple followed him to the barn, her presence now so routine he barely registered it. As he fed the cattle and checked water troughs, the donkey provided running commentary in the form of various brays and snorts. "You have opinions about everything," Caleb observed. Maple tossed her head as if to say that of course she did, and someone needed to keep him informed. By the time Eliza was ready to leave, the sun had fully risen, painting the ranch in shades of gold and amber. Caleb helped her saddle Grant, then stood watching as she rode toward town, confident and capable, exactly the kind of partner he'd never expected to find. He spent the day working on repairs and improvements, his mind half on the tasks at hand and half on plans for the clinic. The work felt different now, not just maintenance to stave off decay, but building toward something, investing in a future that included more than just himself. Around midday, an unexpected visitor arrived. Caleb looked up from the fence post he was setting to see a rider approaching, young, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested someone working up courage. "Mr. Vance," the young man called as he drew near. "That's me." The rider dismounted, holding his hat in his hands with the awkward formality of someone unused to social calls. "My name's Daniel Crawford. I own the property that borders yours to the south." Caleb knew the name. The Crawford place had been struggling for years, barely making it through each winter. He'd never met the current owner, having made it his policy to avoid neighborly interactions. "What can I do for you, Mr. Crawford?" "Please call me Daniel." The young man shifted uncomfortably. "I heard that Mrs. Hart, that she's been helping folks around here. Medical help, I mean. My wife, she's expecting our first child, and she's scared. Her mother died in childbirth, and she's terrified the same will happen to her. Something in Caleb's chest tightened. He recognized fear when he saw it, understood the weight of losing someone you loved, the terror of history repeating itself. Eliza's in town today, Caleb said, but she'll be back this evening. I can have her come by your place tomorrow. Relief flooded Daniel's face. I can pay. Not much, but talk to Eliza about payment. She's fair. Caleb paused, then added, Your wife will be fine. Eliza's the best midwife in the territory. She knows what she's doing. Thank you, Mr. Vance. Thank you. After Daniel left, Caleb stood for a long moment, processing the interaction. 6 months ago, he would have sent the young man away, refused to get involved, maintained his isolation. Now, he'd offered help without hesitation, had actually provided reassurance to a stranger. The transformation felt monumental and completely natural at the same time. Eliza returned as the sun was setting, bringing news that Thomas's wife and baby were thriving, and that Mrs. Henderson had delivered a healthy son with minimal complications. She also brought an unexpected question. How would you feel about getting married? She asked over dinner, her tone as casual as if she were discussing the weather. Caleb nearly choked on his stew. What? Married, you and me. Making this official. Eliza's eyes sparkled with amusement at his reaction. Unless you prefer we continue living in sin, which is fine with me, but people in town are starting to talk. People always talk. True. But some of the more conservative folks are refusing to let me attend their births because of our living arrangements. It's becoming a professional issue. Caleb set down his spoon, studying her carefully. Is that the only reason? Because of your practice? No, Eliza admitted. I want to marry you because I love you, because I want to build a life with you, because every morning I wake up in this house feels like coming home. The professional issue is just convenient timing. That's the least romantic proposal I've ever heard. How many proposals have you heard? Exactly one, and it was significantly more romantic than this. Eliza laughed. Fair enough. Would you like me to try again? I could get down on one knee, compose poetry, make grand declarations. No, Caleb said, reaching across the table to take her hand. This is perfect. It's honest and practical and completely us. He paused, feeling emotion well up in his chest. Yes, I'll marry you. I want to marry you. Good, because I already talked to the minister in town, and he can perform the ceremony in 2 weeks. You were that confident I'd say yes? I was that confident we belonged together. She squeezed his hand. Was I wrong? No, Caleb said softly. You weren't wrong. They married on a clear spring day, the ceremony held at the ranch with a handful of witnesses from town. Caleb wore his best suit, brushed clean and pressed for the first time in 20 years. Eliza wore a simple dress the color of cream, with wildflowers in her hair that she'd picked that morning. Maple attended, naturally, wearing a flower garland that Eliza had woven for her. The donkey behaved with unusual decorum, only braying once during the actual vows, which everyone agreed showed remarkable restraint. The ceremony was brief, the words traditional, but when Caleb slipped the ring onto Eliza's finger, a simple gold band he'd bought in town, so different from the elaborate ring he'd given Sarah, but no less meaningful, he felt something settle into place, a sense of rightness, of completion, of moving forward while still honoring what had come before. They celebrated with a meal at the house, food prepared by several women from town who'd taken it upon themselves to ensure the occasion was properly marked. Caleb found himself surrounded by people, conversation, laughter, all the things he'd avoided for 2 decades, and discovered he didn't hate it. In fact, he almost enjoyed it. As the sun set and guests began to leave, Daniel Crawford approached Caleb with his wife, a small woman who looked far too young to be facing motherhood. Thank you, Daniel said, for sending Eliza to us. My wife feels so much better knowing she'll have help when the time comes. I'm glad, Caleb said, and meant it. After the last guest departed, Caleb and Eliza stood on their porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Maple grazed nearby, her flower garland now askew but still determinedly in place. Well, Eliza said, leaning against Caleb's side, we're officially married. Officially, how does it feel? Caleb considered the question. How did it feel to have opened his heart again? To have chosen love over safety? To have allowed someone past every defense he'd spent 20 years constructing? Terrifying, he admitted. And perfect. Both at the same time. That sounds about right. Eliza turned to look up at him. I know this wasn't easy for you, letting me in, letting yourself feel again. I want you to know I see that, I appreciate it, and I'm not going anywhere. You'd better not, I just married you. True. Divorce would be complicated. Also, Maple would never forgive you. As if hearing her name, the donkey wandered over and inserted herself between them, demanding attention. Caleb scratched her ears while Eliza stroked her nose, the three of them standing together in the gathering darkness. She really is the reason for all this, you know, Eliza said thoughtfully. What do you mean? Maple. If she hadn't kept escaping, you never would have offered to fix my fences. We might have stayed polite strangers, you on your side of the property, me on mine. Caleb considered this. It was true. Maple's stubborn refusal to stay confined had forced interactions he would have otherwise avoided. The donkey's chaos had been the catalyst for connection, her unpredictability the crack that allowed light into his carefully maintained darkness. I suppose I owe her thanks, he said reluctantly. Maple brayed, loud and triumphant, as if she'd been waiting for this acknowledgement. She'll never let us forget it, Eliza warned. She never lets us forget anything. They went inside eventually, leaving Maple to her nighttime grazing. The house felt different as a married couple's home, not drastically, but in small, indefinable ways. As if the commitment they'd made had somehow altered the very air, made the walls more solid, the future more certain. That night, lying beside his new wife, Caleb found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him here. The 20 years of isolation, the chance encounter with a stubborn woman and her impossible donkey, the slow thawing of a heart he'd thought frozen beyond recovery. I never thought I'd be happy again, he said into the darkness. Eliza's hand found his, their fingers intertwining. Are you happy? Yes, more than I have any right to be. You have every right, she said firmly. Suffering doesn't earn you anything except more suffering. Happiness isn't a reward for pain endured. It's just what happens when you stop running from it. When did you get so wise? I've always been wise. You just weren't paying attention. Caleb laughed, the sound still feeling new and wonderful, and pulled her closer. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, two people who'd survived their separate losses and found unexpected grace in shared life. The seasons turned, spring giving way to summer's brief warmth, then to autumn's golden decay, and finally to winter's return. But this winter felt different from the 20 that had preceded it. The ranch thrived under their combined attention, the cattle healthy and well-tended, the buildings in better repair than they'd been in years. The clinic Eliza had envisioned became reality. The old cabin transformed into a proper medical facility with Caleb's help. They worked on it together through the summer and fall, adding rooms, installing proper equipment, creating a space where Eliza could practice her skills and serve the growing number of patients who sought her out. Word of her competence had spread beyond Iron Ridge, and women came from distant settlements to have her attend their births. Caleb found himself assisting more often, his steady presence and physical strength becoming as valued as Eliza's medical expertise. They became a team, known throughout the territory, their partnership extending beyond marriage into genuine collaboration. Daniel Crawford's wife delivered a healthy daughter in October, Eliza attending the birth, while Caleb waited outside with the terrified father, offering quiet reassurance born of personal understanding. When mother and child both survived, Daniel wept with relief, and Caleb felt something close to peace, as if helping save this family had somehow balanced the scales for the family he'd lost. One evening in late November, as the first major snowstorm of the season battered the ranch, Caleb and Eliza sat by the fire in their living room. Maple had somehow gotten inside. Neither of them could figure out how she kept managing it, and was lying near the hearth, her ridiculous bulk taking up an absurd amount of space. We should probably make her go to the barn, Eliza said without conviction. Probably. Neither of them moved. The donkey had become an integral part of their household, her presence as essential as furniture, her chaos as familiar as breathing. I was thinking, Eliza said, setting down the medical journal she'd been reading, about expansion. The clinic? The ranch. Your cattle herd could easily handle more head, and with both of us working it, we could manage a larger operation. Maybe even hire some help, bring in a hand or two for the heavy work. Caleb considered the idea. For 20 years, he'd kept the ranch small, manageable, limited to what one isolated man could handle alone. The thought of expanding, of growing, of building something significant felt both exciting and terrifying. That would mean change, he said carefully. Everything means change. The question is whether it's change toward something or away from something. Toward, Caleb decided. Definitely toward. They began planning that night, discussing possibilities, sketching out ideas, building a vision of a future that was ambitious and hopeful and utterly unlike the narrow existence Caleb had maintained for so long. As they talked, Maple snored beside the fire, her presence a reminder of how the smallest disruptions, a stubborn woman, an impossible donkey, could fundamentally alter the course of a life. Spring returned to Iron Ridge, as it always did, bringing with it renewal and possibility. The ranch had indeed expanded, 3 new hands hired to help manage an increased cattle herd. The clinic was thriving, Eliza's reputation drawing patients from across the territory. The house had been further improved, weathered but well maintained, a home in truth rather than just structure. And Caleb Vance, once a ghost haunting his own property, had become fully, vibrantly alive. He stood on his porch one morning, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over land he'd worked for 3 decades. Eliza was still sleeping, exhausted from attending a difficult birth the night before. Maple grazed in the near pasture, her coat shaggy with winter growth that would need trimming soon. Movement on the hill caught Caleb's eye, and he turned to see the 3 graves that marked his first family's resting place. He hadn't visited them in months, not out of neglect, but because the weight of grief that had once pulled him there daily had finally eased. On impulse, he set down his coffee and walked up the hill, the morning grass wet with dew, soaking his boots. When he reached the graves, he stood quietly, looking at the weathered markers. "I'm happy," he said aloud, the words feeling important even though he was speaking to stone and earth and memory. "I know you'd want me to be. It took me 20 years to figure that out, but I finally did." The wind whispered through the pine trees, carrying the scent of spring and thawing earth. Caleb thought about Sarah, about Emma and Michael, about the life they'd built together and the future they'd been denied. And then he thought about Eliza, about the unexpected gift of second chances, about the courage required to love again despite knowing how devastating loss could be. "Thank you," he said to Sarah, to the universe, to whatever force had brought Eliza into his life. "For everything. For the years we had, for the strength to survive losing you, for the chance to live again." He stood there a moment longer, then turned and walked back down the hill toward his house, where smoke was now rising from the chimney. Eliza would be awake, making breakfast, probably complaining about Maple having somehow gotten inside again. Life was waiting, full and rich and complicated and wonderful. Caleb had survived 20 years in the frozen frontier of Iron Ridge by building walls, by refusing to feel, by existing rather than living. He'd thought that was strength, that isolation was safety, that the only way to avoid pain was to avoid connection entirely. He'd been wrong. Real strength wasn't in walls, but in the courage to tear them down. Safety wasn't in isolation, but in the risk of genuine connection. And pain, while inevitable, was the price paid for the profound joy of loving and being loved. As he reached the porch, the door opened and Eliza appeared, wrapped in a blanket, her hair sleep-mussed and her eyes still soft with dreams. "Where were you?" she asked. "Just visiting the hill." Understanding crossed her face. "Are you all right?" "I'm perfect," Caleb said, and meant it. He climbed the steps and pulled her into his arms, kissing her thoroughly while Maple brayed from inside the house, no doubt complaining about being ignored. "We really need to stop letting her in," Eliza murmured against his lips. "We really do. We're not going to, though." "No, we're not." They went inside together, to warmth and coffee and a donkey who was trying to eat the kitchen curtains, to arguments and laughter and the messy, beautiful reality of shared life, to all the tomorrows Caleb had stopped believing in and now couldn't imagine living without. On the frozen frontier of Iron Ridge, where winter never truly ended and survival required strength that most people never had to discover, Caleb Vance had learned the hardest lesson of all, that surviving alone was easy, a choice born of fear and maintained by isolation. But choosing love, after everything, after loss and grief and 20 years of practiced numbness, choosing to open your heart again despite knowing it could be broken, choosing partnership and vulnerability and hope, in a place that offered no guarantees of anything except hardship. That was what made a man truly alive. And Caleb Vance was finally, abundantly, gloriously alive. The ranch thrived. Laughter returned to rooms that had been silent for too long. Eliza's clinic saved lives, including the life of a rancher who'd forgotten how to live. And Maple, the stubborn donkey who'd refused to stay in her place, who'd broken through every barrier and ignored every boundary, stood as living proof that sometimes the most unlikely forces bring about the most necessary changes. In the end, it wasn't the grand gestures or dramatic moments that defined transformation. It was the daily choice to show up, to try, to let someone matter. It was mornings on the porch and evenings by the fire. It was shared work and shared laughter, and the simple, profound act of choosing partnership over isolation. It was a life built not from the ashes of what was lost, but alongside those ashes, honoring the past while embracing the future. It was everything Caleb had thought impossible, made real by the courage to believe in possibility again. And on that unforgiving frontier where beauty and brutality existed in constant tension, where every spring was a hard-won victory over winter's grip, Caleb Vance had discovered that the greatest act of defiance against loss wasn't in refusing to love again. It was in loving anyway.